Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to be your moderator. My name is Kirk Siegler. I'm a reporter for NPR News, and I cover the Western U.S. and climate change slips its way into pretty much every story we're doing these days. You have found yourself, for the good of the order, at the panel titled, Can and Should Journalism Be a Part of the Solution to the Climate Crisis? It's Thursday, April 13th. This is being live streamed. 2023 at 3:30 p.m. And before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that Boulder is on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of indigenous peoples who have traversed, lived in, and stewarded lands in the Boulder Valley since time immemorial. Those indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. One other thing before we get started, that we'll have a chance to get to your questions. The Q&A will be reserved for the end of our discussion here with our esteemed panelists, who I'm about to introduce. We'll be using a note card system to receive questions from the audience, and at any time in the session, you just simply raise your hand to request a note card, and a pencil from one of our producers. You must write legibly. I'm getting flagged there. If you're a student, please note this on the question on your card, and when you finish your hand, you can hand it to the producer who will bring it up to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. I think done with reading from the script. So we have a great discussion here we're going to launch into really briefly. I'll introduce the panelists, and I think you have the bios of them too. So to my right is Stacy Feldman. She's the founder and publisher of the Boulder Reporting Lab. It's a digital nonprofit news organization that launched to inform and empower Boulder County residents. She is a recent Ted Scripps Fellow in the Center for Environmental Journalism here at CU. We have a current Ted Scripps Fellow, Gulnaz Khan, who's a climate editor at TED, and is studying and wrapping up her time on her fellowship here in Boulder in a few weeks. She's examining the relationship between religion and climate change, among other things, which I think you'll probably hear from. And Stephen Robert Miller, at the end, is a journalist who writes about climate change. He was a Ted Scripps Fellow in environmental journalism here at CU in 2018, right? 2018, 2019. So we have some current and quite recent fellows. This may sound a little bit lazy on my part, but you're sitting at a panel called Can and Should Journalism Be Part of the Solution to the Climate Crisis? So that's our first question. I didn't come up with it. But I think as reporters, this is something we wrestle with a lot because we've often been taught, we were all told and taught correctly, that we're not to be activists and necessarily advocate for a cause. On the other hand, we are out covering the crisis of our time. So how do we balance that? Who wants to start? Stacy, do you want to start with that?
Sure. The short answer to that question from me is a definitive and resounding yes. But I'll qualify that by saying that I don't think journalists should be in charge of solving anything except for maybe the problems in journalism. But there is certainly an indirect role that we especially now, play in being part of conversations that illuminate solutions to the crisis. I believe fundamentally the role of journalism is to be in pursuit of the truth, and that as journalists, our job day to day is to see if we can get the best obtainable version of the truth by using journalistic techniques and practices and adhering to journalistic ethics, reporting deeply, being exceedingly fair, and checking our own personal biases, and being hyper aware of why we do not put certain perspectives in our stories and in our reporting, and hopefully operating within institutions that hold us as individual journalists accountable. I think our current moment of climate crisis makes this ever more urgent and important because for so many years, unfortunately, I think journalists, not all of us, and certainly none of us, got it wrong.
We don't ever make mistakes.
We got it so wrong, and they got it wrong by reporting climate change as a political story and framed the issue almost as both sides, like we do when we're doing horse race coverage of politics. And unfortunately, I think fell into the trap of giving way too much credence to politicians and to fossil fuel industry interests without recognizing that a lot of these people and players and institutions were deliberately trying to foster misinformation. So I think we're behind that. I hope at least mainstream media is, and I think it's incumbent upon journalists and journalism to cover climate change as a science story and as a policy story. And I think if we do that, and as journalists, the best journalists climate journalists I've worked with, have become subject matter experts in the science. And so when a corporation or a local government or regional government, any institution comes forward with a solution, they have the science by which to measure whether that is going to be effective. So I think if we do that, and we're in pursuit of the truth, and we become expert in the consensus science, and we elevate that because it is frightening and it's alarming. And if we write about solutions and also on the flip side of that, write about and report on who's standing in the way, who's blocking solutions, then I think that we will inevitably be part of the solution, right? We will trigger new conversations. We will trigger lawsuits against bad actors. But I think, I never think about solving anything. I think as a reporter, I just think about, let's just do a good job.
Okay. Gulnaz, let's springboard off that. Is it our role to be a part of the solution?
I think that's a tricky question. I think we certainly have a role in addressing the climate crisis, but that question is sort of predicated on the assumption that the press can fulfill its function, right? So that we live in societies that protect and uphold press freedoms and allow us to do this public service of reporting and educating. And I think when you're reporting on climate change, the reality is we are challenging these incredibly powerful and well-funded institutions, right? We're talking about politicians, big corporations, the fossil fuel industry, and there are often political and economic interests in maintaining the status quo that maybe contradicts the work that we're trying to do as journalists. So I was actually looking at, the most recent Press Freedom Index, and it was saying, that the U.S. ranks 42nd, which is pretty shocking because I think historically, you think of the U.S. as this kind of beacon of free speech and press freedoms. But I think we're seeing more and more this real erosion of public trust in the work that we're doing, and that absolutely affects our ability to affect change and to do the work that we need to do. So I think a lot of people, when they think of press freedoms, we're looking at the journalist, for example, that was just arrested and detained in Russia, right? But there are also these more covert forms that I think are all around us and that we should be paying more attention to. So I think kind of this, consistent denigration of the press by politicians is one, for example. The kind of rampant closure of local newsrooms just in the last couple years is a huge problem. I think, I'm from the East Coast, so I had never experienced a wildfire before, but I know here in Boulder in December, when we had a local wildfire, The people that were disseminating information were the local journalists, so that's critically important. So I think you can, look at some of those things and say, yes, we absolutely are, have a responsibility to educate and be part of the solution, but also acknowledge that we're working within an imperfect system. So I think it's important to talk about what stories we're telling and how we're telling them, but also really this more fundamental question of how do we protect journalistic integrity and maintain public trust in the stories that we're telling.
Okay, so we're in a situation where we have eroding public trust. Is it time then, Stephen Miller, to become an activist? Do you bristle at this characterization that, can and should journalism be part of the solution to the climate crisis? That really means, as I read it, we're jumping into the fray where we're supposed to be the people on the outside, calling people out.
Right. No, I definitely wrestle with that question. I worked for several years as an editor at an organization that focused on solutions journalism, and I eventually left that position to freelance because I wanted a little bit more breadth of what I was writing. I felt kind of pigeonholed into writing a certain way because everything had to come at every story from the perspective of having a solution at hand. I think, piggyback on the last two things you guys said, one, thinking about science journalism and solutions, and to me that there's a contradiction there, because what does a solution have to do with the truth? Talk about the importance of truth in journalism. Truth and solutions have nothing to do with each other, right? They don't necessarily have to. They can. We hope that they do. But there's no requirement that a solution be true. Scientists don't approach their work thinking that they know the truth and then they set out to find the information that supports that. They set off with a potential question and then they follow the road that leads them to the actual truth. And that matters because of what Gulnaz just said, talking about the true aspect, the amount of freedom we actually have as journalists today and how much influence we get from all sorts of things, not just politicians, but also our own companies, the people who own all these media organizations that we work for that have a way they want us to report on everything we report on, as well as all the PR organizations that work for Exxon, and also all the people running like the Tesla and whatever else. Like people who are promoting these solutions have super well-funded PR organizations, people who work for them just to make sure that journalists find these solutions and report on them as if they are solutions. That affects our ability to actually act as a free press. So how then can we be really seeking truth from a scientific perspective if we're like scientific journalists, if we're coming at it from the perspective of already knowing what the solution is? So yeah, I wrestle with that.
Stacy touched on something, not to put it right back to you, but to tee this up, and if you don't have to answer this or you can answer after somebody else, but this is sort of this ages-old, you touched on this ages-old controversy that we are often faced with. Well, the news media is giving too much credit to the other side, and they're just full of crap, and they're the climate deniers. For quite a while, I think generally we have sort of moved past giving the climate deniers a voice, but how do we contend? I guess my question is, how do we contend when you do have a growing political movement funded by, say, the Koch brothers and others, of really disseminating anti-climate change information? Do we just ignore it? I mean, we're reporters, and there's a big, loud voice out there in the room trying to affect policy. I mean, we can't just ignore that, right? So how do we not give too much time to the science that we know is not true, but we can't just ignore it, right? Or can we?
No, we can't. It's a question that I worked for many years at a climate news organization called Inside Climate News, and we were doing climate account.
We got a fan.
Cool. We were doing climate accountability journalism. We launched in 2007, so it didn't exist back then. And I think we're trailblazers in some ways, and just writing with authority and taking on disinformation and misinformation. So sure, we write about it for what it is. It is a deliberate attempt to sow uncertainty around consensus science on climate change in order to delay climate change regulation in the United States. The campaigns have been exceedingly successful because we now in our country, one of two of our political parties denies basic climate science, which, climate science is the greenhouse gas effect, and we learned about it in 6th grade. It's like in pretty wild how successful these campaigns have been. So yeah, I think reporting about, treating it as if it's legitimate science, and to Stephen's point, it is true that the science is not truth, and that's why I'm always careful to say our job is to seek out and elevate the best obtainable version of the truth. When it comes to climate science, that means focusing on the consensus science that has emerged through the IPCC process, through peer review, thousands of scientists working on it. It does, it's not necessarily truth, but it's where the scientific understanding is at. I think treating the 1% of skeptical science or of scientists as the same, I really hope as journalists we are beyond that. And I'll just say one more thing. At Inside Climate News, especially in the early years, people would call us advocates all the time. And I just got to a point where I just didn't care. And you can call me a cat. I'm not a cat. I'm a person. Like that's what it felt like. And I think, if you're doing this work, you just have to have your principles and your ethics and your values, and just ensure that you are being fair and sticking to journalistic practices. And it just bounces off me. I don't care if someone calls me an advocate. It has no effect.
Your response, it sounds like you've had that question a lot. Your response could probably be forwarded to newsrooms as guidance. It's not. It's this. It's a well-funded.
Yeah.
Gulnaz, you have a little bit more when you're not a fellow. You have a little bit more time. I think in terms of working on podcasts, a little bit more long form, perhaps. Is this something? Do you have thoughts on whether we're giving too much, or how we're covering as the news media writ large this political faction of disinformation, I guess, for lack of a better word?
So I do think about how, journalism and stories, what that looks like on different platforms. With some of my work at TED Talks right now, we look at actually how to condense stories. So not just long form, but a lot of people now are getting their information through social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok. So actually, I think we have the opposite problem in having to condense stories in a way that they can lose their nuance. And if that's the only exposure to that information you have, then it's really difficult, to explain some of these complexities in that way. And I think more broadly, my concern is, is it becoming more difficult for us as a society to discern fact from fiction with all these new technologies? So it's these new social media platforms, things like artificial intelligence, they're really changing the way that we publish and consume journalism. And I don't think any of those things are inherently good or bad, but they are dramatically shaping our culture and public opinion. And they do have, the potential for this kind of widespread disinformation. So one of the things, that Stacy was talking about, these really well-funded campaigns by, the fossil fuel industry have gone beyond just the regular climate denialism. I think, we as a country can pretty confidently say most people, accept that climate change is real. Those tactics have kind of become more insidious. So they're now funding campaigns, attacking renewable energy, things like the development of wind farms. And I think these platforms make it really easy for things that are not journalism to masquerade as journalism. And I think that's the really tricky thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Stephen, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. And then I think I totally understand where Stacy's coming from, too, about letting it bounce off when someone calls them a journalist an advocate. That line is increasingly blurred. I think back on it's not like things have really, have things really gotten that much worse? I mean, there's not like a Vietnam War happening right now. There was a time when like these types of things were happening in our lives. We act today like we're being confronted with like the worst things that ever happened in humanity, and maybe they are, but that's not to say that bad things haven't happened in the past. But we seem to be reacting to it in a different way now for a lot of different reasons. That's an aside, sorry.
Well, we have information coming at us constantly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's another point. But as the advocacy thing, I don't like it personally when people call me an advocate. And that's not because I am not one. I think personally I'm absolutely an advocate. But I believe there's got to be a role for just news in our society. And to what you were just saying, like that it's so easy today for that line to be blurred between advocacy and journalism and just what's happening and what everybody thinks should be happening. That line has gotten more and more fuzzy over the years with this advent of so many different forms of content coming at us from all different angles. Somebody's got to hold the line and just say, this is what's happening. And if the people whose job it is to do that are feeling like they shouldn't be doing it, they should be, smudging it a little bit more, well, it further complicates things. I absolutely believe that there's a enormous and incredibly valuable role for advocacy journalism. I just also think that there's an equally valuable, perhaps even more valuable role for people who just tell what's happening. And that's really should be happening at the local news level, which is why everybody should subscribe to their local newspaper.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, how do you, can I stop you? I mean,
Yeah.
how do you
Full
restore,
reporting lab.
if you've got a major U.S. political party who's going in one direction, how do you restore the public trust and get them to pay attention to this major crisis?
Well, okay.
Easy question.
First of all, yeah, I know, right? First of all, whatever we're doing now has not worked. So I'm all for alternatives. I think maybe it's a bit obvious, but that for me is definitely a local news, local journalism, local politics. There needs to be a response from the local in order to fix that problem. You're not going to steer the national political campaigns, right? We mentioned earlier how one of the political parties in this country does not recognize the science of climate change. Well, the other one does, but they don't do anything about it. So great, that's helped us a lot.
And these days we're in this, every day there's a headline about a newsroom being hollowed out, or Gannett, typically newspapers cutting local news, and all politics is national. So
Right.
is that the solution
It's a
if we're
huge
talking
problem.
about
Huge
solutions?
problem. We can't think
yeah,
about that.
go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
I'm getting all worked up over here.
Is that we're talking about if we're part of the solution, is then a solution to create more news outlets that may be funded in a different way, such as I think in this state, the Colorado Sun gets a lot of accolades for what it's been able to do, because there aren't really, yet anyway, a lot of very successful local news startups, and I think you guys have a lot of expertise on this. So is this a way to, I guess my question, what's your question, Kirk? Is this a way that could help restore the trust a little bit when most people in places where their newspapers have been cut, it's anemic coverage and they're just getting national politics and they're just watching MSNBC or Fox News? This is a local issue.
I think the primary function of a local news organization is to inform residents on what's happening locally, to ensure that they are empowered and educated voters at the local ballot. I do not think the primary function of a local news organization is to report news about what's happening in Washington, because we don't live in Washington. That's not a great use of our time. So, but I do think there's been a lot of documented evidence of that, is there's a tremendous amount of mistrust in journalism. When people trust news, they tend to trust their local news more than national news. So there is an opportunity, perhaps, to help restore trust in journalism as a whole at a local level. But that's a little bit different than, repairing all of public trust in journalism, which is not something I would ever want to take on as a mission, because I think that, we're entering into almost impossible territory when you think of that challenge.
So it's like 8 to 10 more years
your
of
job at
fellowship studies.
NPR.
Right. So other thoughts on this? Anybody else want to weigh in before I launch another question? Okay, so if there are questions, I'm supposed to remind the audience, if you do have questions, there are supposedly some note cards making their ways around. Doesn't seem like it, but maybe. Okay. Oh, yeah. Oh. Okay. Then you can write down, if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and someone will bring a note card, and then they will bring it up to me, the gatekeeper, who may or may not ask your question. No, I'm kidding. So let's talk solutions again. I know we have some differing views about solutions and whether we're part of the solution, but there's a lot of push right now, not just in climate change coverage, for so-called solution journalism. That is, highlight things that are working. That is, present news or shine a light on things that that might make the audience a little less prone to throwing up their hands. If we give them too much climate change doom and gloom, do they then just think it's an intractable problem? Are there examples that you guys have done in your work where you think that's of value? And are we doing enough of it, or are we doing too much of it? Gulnaz, you're up.
Easy question.
Good thing I didn't put any thought into these questions, because they might have been even harder.
So I really think here there needs to be a healthy balance, right? I think we often hear, and organizations that I've worked for have really harped on this idea that people don't want to read bad news. It doesn't get clicks. And, again, there we go to some of these media revenue models that can you tell the types of stories that you want to tell and you think are important without kind of those economic interests dictating the types of stories that you do. But that issue aside, I think to me, false hope and pessimism are kind of mirror images of each other because both lead to inaction, right? This idea that we're doomed no matter what leads to inaction, but also this idea that some magic technological solution is going to solve the climate crisis also leads to inaction. So I think we need kind of a healthy balance where we acknowledge our grief and our loss, that we acknowledge that we have gotten to a point where we are going to lose things, and we are losing things. We're seeing widespread biodiversity loss, humanitarian crises, but that there is still hope. So these are degrees of loss, and we still have an opportunity to dictate how much loss that will be. So I also think with solutions, and this may be a controversial opinion, I'm curious what these two think, is that yes, we absolutely need to report on the facts and the science, but I also think we need to appeal to people's value systems. And this is really what I've been looking at all year. You mentioned that I'm looking at the intersection of climate change and religion. I think, it is worth appealing to this idea that that the earth, the planet, these living things are things that are worth protecting. And I don't think that makes me biased. I think it makes me human. And I think, we should allow more space for that in our coverage as well.
So that's the question. What do you guys think about, what do the rest of you think about doing reporting in a way that appeals to people's value systems? Does that mean, I don't believe in climate change, so we should be doing more coverage as if climate change is something you believe in? I think that's a way that it gets twisted in phrase. But what do you think about, what do you others think about this idea of reporting the facts, but also looking to appeal to people's value systems? Is it something you do already? Maybe you don't know that you do.
Yeah, I mean, especially as now working in local news, our entire organization is dependent on local people reading us and contributing money to support us. So it's part of an editorial conversation is not just what are we going to write about, but how do we write about things in a way that is not automatically going to shut people down without also in any way diluting our work. So, I mean, I'm so grateful to be reporting in Boulder because, I'd say overwhelmingly, people in Boulder just accept and understand climate science. So there's not really a conversation about whether it's happening. That is so liberating. Thank you, Boulder. So it's exciting to be a journalist in Boulder because you get to really drill down on what matters, and that is the solutions. I think reporting on solutions is the fundamental responsibility of any journalist reporting on climate change today. I think there's a tremendous amount of confusion around that, and then there's two sides of it, which is what are the potential solutions? And I think Stephen said there's no truth in the solutions conversation, but there are better solutions. There are terrible solutions. There are false solutions. So, we need to elevate that. But also, I think it's just as important, and this is where I think the solutions journalism conversation is kind of limited. We need to be reporting aggressively on who's blocking those solutions. In equal measure, what are the solutions and who's preventing those from coming to light? Who is trying to stop the wind farm? Those are coordinated, organized efforts with a lot of money, and there's somebody that is driving that. So
someone who has a financial interest in
exactly.
it, perhaps, yeah.
So that's a part of the solutions conversation I think gets lost.
I just jump in on that. I
Yeah.
think, yes. But I also think that it's very rare that any of you read a journalist working who makes enough money writing an article to fully understand both the problem and the solution that they are presenting to you. I think the average reader does not recognize that. That a lot of these, The Guardian, for instance, an organization that many people read, like the Bible, pays often something like 50 cents a word for a reporter to publish an article, which can sometimes come out to like $300 to $50 an article, or $500 for a 1,000-word piece at the most. That's not very much money. When you're thinking about the amount of time that goes into reporting on some of these issues, it is hard enough just to understand what is really happening with the problem, let alone somehow shove a solution in there, and to know what that solution is actually a solution, and not just a perpetuation of some other problem that the reporter doesn't even know exists. I just got finished writing a book that looks at the issue of solutions that have backfired to the climate crisis all around the world, where these things that we think of are actually fixes to really big problems, like sea level rise or cyclone something, are actually perpetuated by like an old system that never solved the problem it was first intended to solve, but has just kind of been stuck. We've been stuck in this rut, doing the same thing over and over again, thinking about the problem the same way, and using the same kinds of solutions that never work. So I'm not to say solutions can't work, and I do think journalists have a responsibility to report on solutions and offer those up. But I also worry at some point that we kind of disrespect the reader when we think that we have to adhere to or appeal to their values and present solutions to them. As a reporter, I interview people all the time who are incredibly intelligent, and they don't need me to talk down to them, and they know what's happening in the world around them. I think sometimes the best thing we can do is just give them the information and trust that they're intelligent people in this country, and this planet. They are capable of making decisions for themselves.
So let's move outside of Boulder for a second. And Boulder may not be, I may often describe not necessarily the average American town. But how do you all, in an audience outside of Boulder that it's not full of climate scientists and large federal climate labs and a university that dedicates a lot of its resources to atmospheric research and climate change, how do you think the news business could be doing a better job of, or be reporting on climate change in a way that it does not, we don't want to focus too much on solutions, but it does not cause the audience to tune out, the audience to say, this is an intractable problem. It's too late. We're burning up. We can't do anything. So how do you keep the audience's attention on the crisis at hand?
Why do you want that? Why do we have to keep the audience's attention? How has that helped anything? We all get so much content. Has it helped us? Everybody
question
wants
with a
our
question.
attention all the time, and what does it solve?
Well, that speaks to an ages-old thing in journalism. If you present, we have a question here, like how do you, from CU students, one of the great challenges, what are the challenges you have in reporting on climate change, i.e. selling a story to your editor? Your editor often comes back and says, well, what's the tension?
Yeah,
You know,
right. Or these days, what's the solution?
Right, right. So we might be at a deadlock here, but
Well, I think every newsroom is thinking about this because news fatigue is.
You might have to get to the mic.
Sorry, news fatigue is very, very real. We lived through 4 years, not including election years, of a relentless, punishing 24/7 news cycle.
I think we're still in it.
Yeah, it's different. It's different if you
Yeah.
remember. You blanked it out.
Yeah.
And people checked out, and it's understandable. And I think also there's a negativity bias in journalism, and I don't have an answer to the question, but I do think that at least locally, what we try to do is offer a holistic information experience as a place-based news organization. So living in a place is both good and bad, and we want to make sure that our journalism reflects a more comprehensive experience. When it comes to climate change, for instance, every year we are now dealing with evacuation orders or on the edges of them in Boulder. And that's a very frightening reality. And, that's one of the not great things about living here. But at the same time, we are in a place that has a very sophisticated policy conversation that's on the leading edge of solutions, and we want to elevate that too. So I don't know how NPR is handling this, but it's obviously a huge conversation.
Well, we don't have enough staff, but among other things.
There you go. Journalism's underfunded.
So we have a question from the audience. In your experience of climate change coverage, was there anything that gave you hope and optimism? I'll kick this off by sharing a simple, short anecdote. A year ago, I do all these stories. We were all trying to do these big stories about this important stuff, and it airs, and then a couple people are like, great job. But sometimes you just do these seemingly innocuous stories where a year ago or so, year and a half ago, I have a really good friend who works at National Renewable Energy Lab, and he's like, you should come check out this project where we've been working on in various parts of the West, figuring out what crops you might grow underneath solar panels. And it just so happens that one of the prototypes of this agrivoltaic is just to the north of us here outside, well, between Boulder and Longmont, where a family farm that's about 40 acres, the grandson who inherited it, you guys may know the story already, could sell the land and make bajillions because it's Boulder County. With a great view of the Rockies, but he decided to investigate how you might have a solar farm, and then the conversation evolved a little bit, and now they're growing a lot of produce right underneath the solar panels. It's called Jack's Solar Farm. That story that I did in about an hour, it took a little bit longer than that, but we went up there for about an hour, talked to Jack, toured around. It was like, oh, this is really cool. I don't think I've ever done a story in the last 10 years that got more response. People were give us more of this, give us something to give us a good story of inspiration and hope. It's a very small story. He's not solving the climate crisis. He's barely even paying for the solar panels at this point, I think. You can check me. I haven't been back there for a while. But it's a small little thing. So do you guys have examples of stories you've done recently where you kind of walked away feeling, maybe the earth isn't going to burn up? No?
No.
Next. Okay.
I'll let them answer.
I would just go back to this idea that for me, it's degrees, right? Every 10th of a degree matters. So I think, regardless of what we're seeing now or frustration with inaction, the fact that there is still time to, prevent the worst of it gives me hope every day. It's why I keep doing this. But I would also just say, I think, in a lot of national newsrooms, at least, there really is this emphasis on getting the most eyes on a story. And that's part of what we want to do, right? We want We want a lot of people reading about it and caring about it, hopefully. But what I've learned through working with TED specifically, which is really an impact-driven organization, is that it doesn't necessarily matter how many people see your story. It's about one right person seeing the story. So we've had, speakers and talks where just one policymaker saw it or one philanthropist saw it and put the kind of funding or amplification behind it to make it skyrocket and have a real world impact. So I think that also gives me hope that even if one person read my story or saw it and was changed by it, and they are in a position of influence where they work, then I have made a difference.
You touched on something that definitely makes us bristle, though, when we're confronted, or at least I am, from the digital side of things. Well, that story you did on X, the solar garden, for instance, really got a lot of good traffic, so let's get more of those on. It's like, we're not in that business of what works for clickbait. Maybe some of us are, I don't know. But so we have another student question. There are a number of CU journalism students in this audience. I was a CU journalism student once. So Stephen, maybe I'll start with you. Can you provide some tips on how to find good sources and maybe long-term sources for climate stories? Cultivating sources, yeah.
Well, I think the biggest thing is to come back to them repeatedly. I think it's always been a problem with any kind of journalism, and it's not. I don't necessarily think because of fault in the journalists necessarily. It's often just the business side of things. Is you kind of move on from one story to the next. But if you really want good sources on anything, you've just got to spend time with people over the years. I mean, one kind of piggyback on that, and also your hopeful question. I report a lot on agriculture, and over the years of asking farmers in rural America, whether it's in the Southwest, in Arizona, or in Iowa, or wherever else, what they think about climate change, I've recognized people's perspectives start to change. Where there was a time where the same farmer would tell me that climate change, well, they used to say the ozone layer was going to burn us all up, and now that's not a problem anymore. So why should I believe in this climate change stuff? And I've noticed that their perspective has kind of come around, and these are people who you might think, basically, if you just paid attention to CNN or Fox, that they're staunchly in one camp or the other, and life is never that simple. But again, the only reason I know that is because I spent time with this person over years, coming back to them and asking them how their life has changed and how the policies that have been impacted, new presidents that have come around, how they've changed. So I think for journalists, that's really important. And it's the same with solutions. The Jackson Solar Farm is a really hopeful story, but that's a really good question. Is like, what's the viability of this in the long term? Is he making any money? Is he able to actually sell that produce? What's the upkeep on those solar panels? How much is he actually getting out of them? And is it scalable? And those are only questions that you can come around to from spending more time, going back to it over and over again. So
pesky reporters always trying to dampen the good news. No, I'm joking.
Yeah, right.
Any tips on? Are you done? Or
I'm done.
Any tips on cultivating good climate sources? Goals on?
Talking to you.
Yeah. I was looking at you. Sorry.
Yeah, I would say do your research. This is critically important. I talk to a lot of scientists, and they know when you haven't done your research. And I think there is a trust issue right now between journalists and scientists. A few months ago, I actually had the opportunity to talk to a group of scientists doing climate work. And one of the things they expressed was that they're concerned about journalists misrepresenting them or misrepresenting the science. So I would say, do your research ahead of time. They'll know if you haven't. And then also ask lots of follow-up and clarification questions. You don't have to know everything, but definitely make an effort, and I think that goes a long way.
Do you have any advice too?
Nothing specific. I mean, I think to be I think a great journalist, you really have to be profoundly intellectually curious, and I think that'll take you to the right people.
So we talk about climate change as a local, global story. It's a local story that affects everything, and it is a global story at the same time, the local global connection. I would be curious. It's been my observation as somebody who has not been to major climate conferences lately, COP 21 through 26. I might be getting that wrong, I apologize. But big conferences like that where every single dignitary shows up and a lot of news outlets, NPR included, send a whole team of people to an event that could virtually be live streamed, or some might say not even clear that some of the goals being made at these big climate conferences in Egypt are going anywhere, and there's not a lot of accountability. I guess my question is, do you think the news media, major news outlets and even smaller, are spending too much time on these big, some might say dog and pony shows at this point?
Yes.
Yeah.
Although I
What's the
I
value?
went
Is
to a
there
bunch of
is there
them.
another argument?
Well,
Yeah.
I just, as a journalist, just starting out on the beat years ago, I went to all those conferences every year, and I'd say a large percentage of what I learned about climate change and climate science, I got from spending those weeks immersed among experts, and so for me, it was invaluable. I don't know how much NPR is spending to send journalists there. So I don't know.
Well, something you said about the, I'm thinking about the Paris Accord, and like one benefit of of repeatedly reporting on these conferences is recognizing how little gets done from them, right? Mm-hmm. That's the only way we know that they accomplish nothing is because they happen every year, and every year nothing changes. So
I'm not sure that's true. There's a lot that happens that isn't reported. There's a lot of incremental action that we don't know about. But yes, I think it feels glacial. But I think there's a tendency to be very cynical about those conferences, and
because they set these goals and then they don't meet them, and it's like, why do we have a conference that sets a goal that we don't intend to meet?
We were on, after 2015, we were on a great trajectory, and then 2016 happened and set the world back, 20 years. But hopefully, we'll get back on the right track. I don't think they're useless.
I also just think it's important to kind of consider and acknowledge whose voices are present at those conferences, and which ones are amplified.
Yeah, we were just speaking to a criticism that got raised during the most recent Davos conference, where it was rightly asked, I think, some introspective questions like, are these business reporters really in touch with the workers? Or are they here to schmooze? And I know making good sources is good, but I think that's kind of the tension. So what should we be doing better? I mean, we've been kind of talking about this the whole time, but like, what are we missing? Are we not doing enough local? Are we not doing a good enough job connecting the local crisis to the global problem? Should we be doing more local reporting on this? Anyone? No one.
I sometimes worry that this is where some of my animosity towards solutions comes from, is because I sometimes worry about like the diffusion of the problem. A lot of these other solutions, like take the paper straw thing, for instance, like these ulterior solutions kind of tend to distract us from the central problem, which is, and it's not even Trump. I mean, you can say 2016 set the world back. 2016 didn't really set the world back. I mean, the world set the world back. China and India are going to do what they're going to do regardless of Trump. I think that, we need to focus on drawing down global emissions, and that it's not a sexy answer. It doesn't drive a lot of clickbait because people don't like to hear it over and over again, but that is the one thing that we need to do. And sometimes a worry that I have is a lot of these other smaller solutions just distract from that point.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is the only way we address climate change is if our government, our national government, decides to do something about it. This is a national and global crisis. The last time we had meaningful climate legislation, although I guess the most recent sorry, what was it called?
Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, it was, in many ways, it's a climate act, but the last time we had federal climate legislation, with the word climate in it, was 2009. And the reality is the fossil fuel industry bought a Congress, and now, the solutions to that are, and maybe this is the job of journalists, is to explain that. It's things like ending the filibuster. It's how do we stop the unfettered contributions from corporations into our elections. I mean, it's not necessarily, some of these are political solutions. So whether or not someone's reporting about climate action in a small town somewhere is great. We need to do that, but that's not what it's going to take.
So another audience question here. I think we've really motivated all the journalism students to really get up here and get into this profession, right? So we have being a little sarcastic. But it is exciting. It's that. And people will only write in when they're angry about something. You should know that. So here's a question that I like, and I'm so glad I'm moderating because I don't have to answer it. I'm just going to read it verbatim. I'm in my second year as a journalist, presumably full-time at a news outlet, and every week I feel like I'm on the brink of leaving the industry. Which is true, which is the thing. But I think it's, to your point, it's kind of been a thing for a long time. We tend to think that we're in this crisis right now, but things were pretty shitty in the 90s, the 70s, the 60s. Anyway, so we just didn't have social media to remind us every waking hour and news alerts and push alerts from the New York Times that something's burning. Anyway, so do you have advice to this young journalist on how to stick it through based on everything we've just discussed? Dying local newsrooms, decline in public trust.
Take it away, Gulnaz.
I mean, we're all still in the business, so that's hope. Right? Yeah.
I mean, personally, I have had this crisis as well. I think all journalists have, honestly. I've had points where I thought of leaving the industry. I was burned out. The prospects didn't look good. I think at that point, I really had to ask myself, like, do I love this? Can I do anything else? But I mean, I also think it's smart to have a backup plan. Personally, I do. That's just my honest answer. I think the world will always need journalists, and whoever wrote in this question, I hope you maybe do stick it out and find your love for it again. That was another thing I asked myself, in this time of crisis. I had felt like I became a journalist based on all these high ideals, and when I actually got into the newsroom, nothing was like that. There were all these constraints. It was incredibly bureaucratic. But there are always, other places to go, right? So I actually ended up leaving the newsroom. That was kind of making me feel that way and rediscovering my love for writing and for journalism. And now, I'm flourishing, and I'm really glad that I chose to stick it out. But I think it's such a personal question. But that's my personal experience.
Yeah, and whoever just asked that question, email me, Stacy at boulderreportinglab.org. Newsrooms can be really toxic. We're hiring.
Yours isn't
we're
toxic,
trying to do it
though.
differently.
Yeah. I'm actually late for the 4 o'clock meeting, so I need to go. No, I'm kidding. No. So we've had a number of thematic questions on how do we restore the public trust, and how do we address the crisis that we read all the time in terms of hollowing out, corporations shutting down, local newsrooms, or there just being 1 or 2 reporters left. In regards to climate change or not, I mean, climate change is certainly not the only crisis, but I wonder, Stacy, if you might tee this up a little bit by telling us just a little bit more about what you've started here in Boulder, because I think it might be working to those ends. And then I'd ask you guys also to respond to this too.
Sure. So Boulder Reporting Lab is part of a sort of a loose movement of, sometimes we are a nonprofit, not always nonprofit, news organizations that are ground up, that are founded from within side of the community to address the decline of local newspapers here in Boulder, like many places across the country. We have a newspaper that is owned by a hedge fund called Alden Global Capital, which is now the second largest owner of newspapers in the country. And the business model is to essentially treat their papers as distressed assets. So they come in and they cut it for anything that, they get rid of, sell off anything that has any value, including the real estate, and also
the once massive
the reporters. They get rid of the reporters, and then they raise subscription costs. So their business model by design is to shut these things down.
I was just going to interject really quick. Of course, it's the same, the once massive Denver Post, right?
Well, yeah, and the Denver Post is actually sort of alive and kicking and doing really well for a lot of maybe complicated reasons.
But they are owned by Alden Capital.
They all are also. So what we're trying to do, and what many small news outlets like us across the country, we're trying to lay the foundation for a news organization that will be there when the newspaper goes away. And our philosophy is to be issues focused. So we talk to the community and we find out what they want us to write about, and we try to reflect that in our reporting. And hopefully build a business model that can be to lead us on the path of sustainability.
Do you guys, thank you. I thought it might be valuable to get a quick introduction of that, because we're getting this question a lot. Do you guys see other solutions? Sorry, I keep saying solutions. I don't want to trigger anybody here. But are you seeing
microaggression?
Is this a definitely not microaggressions? So is this are you seeing some other examples of this? Do you think this could work if we're trying to figure out how to restore trust in journalism and also get more local reporters? Not your area of expertise.
Yeah, I just hate to be so cynical, but.
It's hard not to be cynical. I mean, there's a huge chunk of the country who has already made its mind up, and they're probably not coming back to us. And maybe they will in a couple of decades, but I think that's what you might be getting at.
Yeah, and I think we should all be very concerned about that. But I would also say, in kind of going back to this idea of press freedoms, yes, we may not necessarily see government interference in, media coverage in the U.S., right? But the reality, and I think you mentioned this already, is that a lot of major media organizations are owned by really a handful of wealthy individuals. And then we see major corporations. So I was an editor at National Geographic. They started as a nonprofit. They were then acquired by Fox, which was then acquired by Disney. So I think we all have an interest in who is really controlling the information that we're seeing, and are there maybe it's policy interventions in place. I think we're also seeing this on social media. There's this big question right now about, these are privately owned for-profit tech companies, but it is where people are getting their information. I think people are getting more information there than they are from traditional, newsrooms and media companies now. And there's this larger question about, well, whose responsibility is it to moderate that or regulate it, and where does that fall into this idea of our freedom of speech? So it's complicated.
So you touched on where people are getting their news. So this kind of question from the audience, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but where do you guys get your news? The actual question is, what's trusted for you guys? Seems like the media with mass audiences soft pedal the reality. The ones telling it like it is have tiny audiences. Are there any exceptions?
I think you find good journalists at any big or small media. You just gotta. I think for me, it's like I find several sources that I respect, and I drop in on those. I don't get my news from Twitter. I barely use Twitter. If you try to find me on Twitter, you'll be disappointed. So I
Same with NPR.
Yeah, so I drop in on, I have national sources that I like, and I have local sources that I like, and I check those every day. I go directly to them, and I have journalists, bylines that I see at those papers that I respect, and I trust them.
Yeah.
We want a new question.
Yeah, I mean, oh.
Yeah, sorry.
I read the New York Times, I read the Washington Post, I read NPR, listen to it. Not just saying that.
I gave her $20 before the panel started.
I think, they're still producing journalism at the highest standards. And, I think I try to gather information, not just journalism, especially with our work locally. Like, I don't think journalists have a monopoly over information. So.
We've got just a couple more minutes left here, so I'm trying to get to as many questions as possible, if you guys will indulge me. Here's another one from the audience. Do you think it's possible to separate climate change from politics? This was brought up, how we stop covering climate change as if it's just about politics. But it seems like when I turn on NPR, I'm hearing the political fallout angle about everything. How's this going to affect the Republicans? How is the Wisconsin Supreme Court race? Because now every single local race is national. Everyone's following it on their phones, the Wisconsin Supreme Court race. I mean, that's a little bit extraordinary about this time that we're in now, but is it possible? I mean, in this current media ecosystem, especially in this country where, at NPR we get this, well, politics stories do really good. They're doing really good right now online.
I personally don't think the two can be disentangled. And then I think there's another question in there for me that I've been thinking about, which is, even if the story isn't directly about climate change and politics absolutely affect journalists' ability to cover climate change. So right now, for example, I'm applying for filming permits in a heavily politicized region, and it's to do climate coverage. But the politics of the region are making it extremely difficult to get that permit approved. So the fact that this is, a geopolitical hotspot prevents, freedom of press. It prevents journalists from actually getting in there to report on issues that are totally not related to politics.
Are you going to share where that is, or is that an up-and-coming?
It's an up-and-coming.
Okay.
Stay tuned. I am on Twitter.
Do you find... maybe Stephen, do you find that there are ways that politics affect or get in the way of how journalists, do you see examples of this, cover climate change?
Well, yeah. I guess there's so many answers to that question. I'm having a hard time,
we can come back to it. Yeah.
One thing I would say is it's important to remember the reason stories get published is not necessarily just because they're important. It's because there's some sort of a timeliness angle to them. Any journalist student in the room will tell you that. And that's one of the reasons I think things often get framed as political issues. It's because there's always a timeliness angle to a political issue. There's always like something happening in politics. There's an election or somebody speaking or something going on. And that gives journalists the timely news hook that we need in order to write an article about something that's actually, like climate change, been going on for a long time and has been relatively consistent.
Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to separate them, but I think it's incumbent on us to separate them. Climate politics should be a separate beat. The last person I want to call if I'm writing a climate science story is a politician, unless they're a scientist. Let's keep them separate. Climate politics is very important because it determines what policies end up, moving forward, gaining momentum, becoming legislation. But, I think journalists love covering politics. It's so fun. It's a horse race. It's like, who's winning? So, we sort of have to resist the urge because it leads to an immense amount of confusion.
Okay, I think we're almost done. There is one question left here that we didn't get to that doesn't have to do with climate change, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway because I think particularly knowing maybe the audience in this city, this might be of interest. How do you think the defamation suit against Fox News will affect press freedom?
I have no idea. Do you know?
Press freedom? I hope it affects the way national news, sorry, did I cut you off?
No.
I hope it affects the way national news approaches its coverage. I mean, I hope they recognize that there are consequences for spewing falsehoods. But I don't know how that,
Okay.
I mean, isn't that what we all hope?
It's kind of ending the panel on a bit of a okay. But thank you all for coming, and I appreciate your time here, and thank our panelists. We ended 2 minutes early, but I feel like
Sorry,
I just wanted to see what they would say about that.
Great job.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.